Everybody doing okay? I keep listening, listening to the morning news, and they're talking about people going through depression and feeling isolated and all this stuff from COVID. And I mean, they're so damn gloomy, they start making me feel bad by the... I mean, you do everything you can to keep healthy, and that's about all you can do about it. So let me get this thing. I don't see it. Oh, there's one person out there in Plainview? Earth calling Plainview? The master must be turned off, and if you're trying to talk in the mic there. Scoot over a little bit so we can see you. Scoot to your left. There you go. I knew there were people in that room. While I'm setting this thing up, there's some folks that are still kind of dragging their feet and getting stuff done. Like getting a book title or something like that. Really need to get that out of the way and have that book in hand, because we're going to start doing things with your book. So, if you have a problem with it, come to me and tell me about it. I think we had at least one person out in Plainview that was sending me panicking messages or something about not being able to do the quiz or something like that. I think we've fixed that now. Trying to get the mic? Or were you just hooked in it? Speak. Try it. Is the light coming on when you push the button? Who's with you in the room? Is your facilitator there? Tell her I want to talk to her. There's a master on there that you need to turn on, I think. That's what your problem is. Either that or we're going to have to learn sign really fast. And I'm not good at it. I know certain signs, but I can't use those in my classes. Like, run. I learned that from an Italian bus driver. I know a few signs in almost every language like that. You learn things like that. Okay, we left off, we were talking, kind of in the beginnings of talking about the British setting up colonies. So let's get over to that. It would work better if I had the stick drive plugged in. What I'm going to be looking at is that PowerPoint. I think it's in Unit 2. It's called English Exploration. It's down at the bottom in Unit 2 lectures, if you want to follow along. I think it's 1E, English Exploration in Colonies. Since you can't get your mic going out there in plain view, can you hear me all right? Okay. I'm sorry for being a talking head and not letting you talk back. I'll have somebody come look at that stuff and see if they can't make it work. It's pretty old and decrepit. We were promised that they would put all new gear in during the summer. It's kind of like the checks in the mail and I'll respect you tomorrow and things like that. I really love you. What other great lies can you think of? Okay. So we looked at Henry VIII. We looked at Bloody Mary. We talked a little bit about Elizabeth. Things that she did. The one thing to remember about Elizabeth as we get into this is that her sister Mary, her older sister Mary, married the King of Spain, who kind of thinks, well, now England should belong to me. When she died, nobody else agreed with him on that, so he offered to marry Elizabeth. Elizabeth told him to buzz off. So they're not going to be friends. And what makes it even worse is that the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth because she's Protestant and refuses to bow to the will of the Pope. And as a result of that, I just lost plain view. As a result of that, they'll come back in a minute. I lost plain view, but I think maybe they're trying to reboot or something. They couldn't talk to me. So. Yeah, they're coming back up. Thank you. I wonder if the volume works now. Anyway, hey, I heard
we're just bringing up the system.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I knew you could talk. Anyway, the point I was making is that Queen Elizabeth had been excommunicated. That gave the King of Spain even more excuse to be her enemy. He's going to spend a whole lot of time after she has Mary Queen of Scots beheaded. He's going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out some way to cause her trouble. And one of those things in 1588 is when he sends a giant armada up to attack England. And some of her sea captain friends have helped build the British Navy up, the Royal Navy up. They still, in size, couldn't match the Spanish Navy. The Spanish military was wealthy, which may explain why this Spanish country was poor. And what happens in 1588 is there's going to be kind of a big battle, and we'll talk about it in a second. I'll go back to it. Don't let me forget it. Probably the earliest person who could be said to have explored on behalf of the British was John Cabot, and he was actually the earliest European explorer, at least since the Vikings. I don't even talk about the Vikings, but they had touched on parts of the northern part of North America, and maybe built temporary settlements, but didn't stay long. John Cabot was actually Giovanni Caboto. He was an Italian, maybe from Venice. And Henry VII, the first Tudor king, commissioned him to go and explore. What was he looking for? What the French and the English were looking for was what they called the Northwest Passage. And the reason, and I think we may have talked about that, it's just a strategic thing. Everybody wants to go to China. The Ottoman Empire blocked the way across the Mediterranean. The Portuguese had a monopoly on going around Africa. The Spanish now were developing, had since the 1500s, developed pretty much a monopoly on the southern route across the Atlantic. So now France and England are left with finding a route, maybe that goes over the northern side of North America to get to China. Of course, there is a route like that, but you have to have a submarine to go because there's ice. Give us a few years, the ice will be gone. Anyway, that's what John Cabot was looking for. Henry VII is going to commission other people to do that. But Henry VIII is going to be too busy. In about 1609, a fellow named Henry Hudson is going to start exploring. He's an Englishman. This is way later. This is, almost 100 years later. First, he'll explore on behalf of the Dutch. He'll claim a lot of territory around what is now New York for the Dutch. And then he's going to explore for the English. He's going to get up to the bay that was named after him many years later, called Hudson Bay, and disappear. The people on the ship didn't like him. They put him on a boat and sailed away and left him. That almost happened to Columbus, by the way. Some of these explorers, I guess, had bad bedside manners or whatever. People didn't like them too much. And here's the fellows, and this is why I told you about the Battle of the Spanish Armada in 1588. These guys are all going to play a role in that. They start out more or less as pirates. I mean, they're people that had enough money to take a ship and go sail somewhere and try and get goodies. And a lot of that involves stealing things from the Spanish, who had trouble protecting their treasures. Probably the first big name was John Hawkins. He's going to steal gold from the Spanish. He's going to steal slaves from the Spanish. Sometimes he's going to sell slaves to the Spanish. He'll be the first Englishman that really gets into the slave business. He's also going to be the guy that more or less designs the Royal Navy. He's going to start putting together the Royal Navy. His cousin, Francis Drake, is going to be the first Englishman, and actually the first European, to truly circumnavigate the globe. I mean, Magellan went on a trip to do that, but he died halfway around. Francis Drake will do that in the 1580s, and in fact, he doesn't just go around the world. On the way around, he sneaks up on the Spanish Manila galleon and captures the Manila galleon, and he takes that to Queen Elizabeth, let's share. And Queen Elizabeth makes him into Sir Francis Drake as a reward for that. But later on, when the Spanish Armada comes to call, when they looks like they're going to try and land troops in England, they bump into two problems, maybe three problems, maybe four problems. They had big ships. By the way, King Philip had to go into Hawke to buy them because he was broke. They didn't have army available because the army was up trying to beat up on the Dutch and make them all go back to the Catholic Church and stop being Calvinists and keep paying money to Spain because he was broke and he needed it. And basically they had launched an 80-year-long war to gain their independence. That's why we have this group of guys called the Watergoos, and I told you about them, I think, last time, right? Well, that's the heart of that fight. A lot of times they didn't have any bases in Holland. Their bases were floating, but they would land at a seaport and try and grab the seaport and cause trouble for them. When the Spanish go up to the English Channel, let's see if I can find the map of it. Those are some of the explorations of these different fellows. and the Spanish go up to the English Channel where that red arrow is pointing, they're gonna go over to the coast and pick up an army that's, I think, about 10,000 strong or something of experienced Spanish soldiers that are fighting the Dutch. They're gonna load them up in the ships, and then they're gonna turn around and go back across the English Channel and land in England and show Elizabeth who's who. And the British knew they were coming, the English, I shouldn't call them the British, they're not British yet. The English knew they were coming. Queen Elizabeth actually put on armor and went out and rode out to encourage the troops who were supposed to repel the invasion. That shows how worried they were about it happening. But they're not able to pick up their soldiers over on the mainland because the sea dogs or not the sea dogs, the sea beggars get in the way. And the Spanish ships are big and heavy, and they can't sail that close to the coast or to the shore, and the sea beggar ships can't. So it's hard for them they're not able to load their soldiers onto the ships. And then to add insult to injury, the British, especially Admiral Sir Francis Drake, they're gonna sail up where these Spanish ships are all milling around in a place called Gravelines, and he's gonna get a brilliant idea, and he's gonna load a ship full of tar. They use tar to seal the cracks between the wood in their ships. They're gonna fill it with tar and gunpowder and old rags and things like that, and light that baby on fire. What they'll do is they'll trim the ship's sails up and all that with a skeleton crew, maybe 3 or 4 guys. They'll get the sails up. The whole crew will get off except for 3 or 4 people. They'll aim it at the Spanish fleet, tie the rudder over so that it won't move, and jump overboard after lighting it on fire. These are the early fire ships. And they were really feared because everybody's ship's made out of wood, not to mention the fact that you depend on sails and they'll burn like nobody's business. And that caused a lot of trouble, and the Spanish fleet scatters in all different directions. I'm not sure how many ships they actually damaged, but it certainly damaged organization. So the Spaniards cut out and they head around the north side of the British Isles, past Scotland, and they run into a really bad storm. There you go, guys. Take a look at this. There's the map and neat red arrow that points at Gravelines. And you can see their path. They go way up around the Orkney Islands, and they come down the west coast of Ireland, and they run into really bad weather, and they lose a whole bunch of ships. If they don't sink, they're damaged badly. And they're short on crewmen now because they were supposed to pick up more people in Holland, which they didn't do. So finally they just tuck their tail between their legs and run for Spain. Some of the British captains said, let's chase after them and finish them off, and the smart one said, they still outnumber us 3 to 1. We did what we want, they're not landing on our island, now let's just stay home. One captain didn't do that. I think I may have told you about it. Did I tell you about him? He was a knothead. He had to chase after the Spanish and beat them up some more, and they turned on him. Then it was like 1 ship against 20, and he died, tied to the mast of his ship, bleeding to death, filled with wood splinters, because that's usually how you died when your ship got hit by a cannonball of its splinter wood. Those wood splinters were deadly. He died cursing his crew because his crew ran up a white flag, or they lowered their flag to surrender, because they were all going to die if they didn't. But basically that brings England into the ranks of the first-rate countries. And Elizabeth engineered that, all in all. So that makes her probably one of the greatest monarchs of England. Plus the fact that she was just good politically. She didn't let religious wars happen while she was queen. There's the Watergusen again. Okay. She's in her final years, and I guess her boyfriend, I'm not sure, I wasn't in the bedroom, so I don't know, if they were just shaking hands and drinking tea or what. Sir Walter Raleigh. By the way, you can tell she liked Sir Walter Raleigh. She wouldn't let him participate in the war with the Spanish Armada. He had to stay home. He was the ship's captain too. She gave him some job that, a title or something, and said, you stay there and do that, so. You can figure how that worked. He's gonna get a charter. He had a half-brother that got another charter further north, but he died at sea because he was not a good sailor. But Walter Raleigh is gonna send a group of people up to the Channel Islands that are off of the Carolinas. That's where all the rich people hang out, like Hilton Head and stuff like that. They have the big golf tournaments there and all that. Well, inside those Channel Islands was an island that we will call Roanoke. There are several big islands like that. Roanoke, most of Roanoke Island, the one they think is Roanoke Island, is pretty much underwater now, at least one end of it. But back then it wasn't, and he's gonna send this one group under his fellow sea dog, Sir Richard Grenville, and he'll drop off a bunch of people on there, and the idea is they'll stay there and then the ships will go and get more people. But they were there for almost a year and decided they didn't like it, so most of them loaded up on the first available ship that they saw and went back to England. They brought with them some local tobacco, they brought with them some potatoes, and a couple of other things, and that was it. Walter Raleigh's not satisfied, he wants to try again. And in 1587, he gets a guy named John White to take a group over. 90 men, 17 women, 11 children. They're actually, planning to set up a colony, a village or something. They're put ashore and they're told, we're going to go back to England and get more supplies and more people. But we all know what happened in 1588. When the ship got home, they were fighting the Spanish Armada. So nobody came back. In fact, no one came back until 1590. And when they came back, there wasn't anybody there. There was a tree and someone had carved, in crude carving, Croat, which is short for Croatan maybe, which is the name of an Indian tribe on one of the neighboring islands. We really don't know what that meant. Does it mean they were fighting them? Does it mean that they were going to go join them because they were starving to death? What was it? My guess is they went to join them. But there's no way to prove that. People are trying to prove that doing things like if you can trace somebody way back to the early days to see if they've got the right kind of DNA or something. It's virtually impossible. One thing that did happen on that colony before it disappeared was a little girl was born, and her name was Virginia Dare. A lot of people like to claim that they're descended from her, but nobody knows what happened to Virginia Dare. So, that's the first attempt, and it fails. Didn't establish a lasting colony. And then Queen Elizabeth dies. Now when she dies, of course, she's, quote, the Virgin Queen, end quote. She has no children, had no husband, so she has to pick an heir. And the heir she picks, or maybe her counselor picked it in her name, I don't know, because she wasn't well, was James VI of Scotland. Guess who his mom was? She was Mary, Queen of Scots, the one that went to the Tower of London and got her head chopped off. James VI is Elizabeth's cousin. He's descended directly from King Henry VII, just as Elizabeth is. And they decide, bring him down, make him King of England. Maybe that will make England and Scotland tighter together. And so that's exactly what happened. James Charles Stuart was his name. They called him the wisest fool in all of Christendom because he was pretty intellectual and educated and all that, but he didn't have a practical bone in his body. He's going to come down and do some things. He's going to get deeply involved in the Church of England, even though most of the people in his family are kind of closet Catholics. But he's going to play the game. And of course, the Church of England at that stage wasn't any different than how, people worshipped and all that than the Church of Rome, except that the King of England was the boss of the church. He's going to get an archbishop. That's the highest level of bishop they have in England. It's the Archbishop of Canterbury. His name is William Laud, L-A-U-D. not necessary to remember his name unless you just thrive on things like that. The two of them are going to fiddle around with the Church of England. And they're going to have problems because some English people are real Protestants. What I mean is they're Calvinist followers of Calvin or Luther or something like that. And those people don't like the Church of England because it's too much like the Catholic Church. And so they're going to crank down on those people, and we'll talk about that when we get to talking about some of the colonies. By the way, he's the fellow that commissioned the King James Bible. Remember, the Catholic Church Bibles were all in Latin, but the Church of England, that's one of the big differences. They're going to do the Bible in English. If I had to say there was a Bible that I was most comfortable with, because I'm so old, it's the King James Version. The Catholic Church certainly doesn't like that version anymore. I'm not sure they ever did. But the newer versions, even of the Protestant Bibles, they're written for 3-year-olds. Their English is so simplistic, and it's kind of sad. King James Version, it's kind of like literature. It's really beautifully written. Once you understand what they're talking about, I mean, I like the word know. And he knew her. What did that mean? It says in the Bible over and over again, and he knew her. In fact, they make jokes about, I didn't know her in the biblical sense, which meant that they had some kind of relations that would produce children. Well, I really like that word. You wouldn't get in trouble for saying that. While James is king, he's still interested in colonies and money. And a bunch of businessmen are going to get together and do one of those joint share companies. They'll call it the Virginia Company. It's an umbrella company. What do I mean by an umbrella company? There's a lot of little companies in it. It's kind of a holding company, if you want. It's named the Virginia Company because they called the whole Atlantic coast of North America Virginia at the time. Inside that company, there's one that has a base in London, and strangely enough, they call it the London Company. There's another one inside that has a base in Plymouth, the seaport, and strangely enough, they're going to call that the Plymouth Company. And then they sat down on a map to decide who could control what territory in the Americas, and somebody drew the map wrong or something, I don't know what it is, but they overlapped. So they had to make special rule that, okay, if you go in the overlapped area, you can't have a colony that's within 100 miles of another colony. And notice these colonies, we'll call them charter colonies. I've talked about the types, right? No? Wrong? There's 3 kinds of English colonies. And if you look in the readings that I put up, anybody looking at actually in that website right now? Are you on Blackboard? Look at your notes and readings. Flip over the notes and readings for a minute. Can you see Unit 2 readings, or Unit 3 readings rather?
No, Unit 2.
Okay, I'll turn them on. They're there. They're just not turned on. In those readings, it explains how the different kinds of, like how the Spanish colonies are organized, how the French colonies were, how the Dutch colonies were to some extent, and how the English colonies were organized. So you can understand it more, but basically, English colonies at the beginning, there were all these little companies that applied to the Crown for permission to settle. They'd have to write a charter, how they're going to do it, kind of, what the rules will be. Then the king signs off on that in exchange for a little moolah. And they're going to go there, set up their colony, and they're going to run it in accordance with their charter. So they choose their own governor, and they figure out what kind of government they'll have and all of that. The first colonies to kind of last, or the first colony to last, was one down on the Chesapeake Bay. I think it was the London Company set this up. Actually, at the very same time, there was another colony that was chartered up north called the Popham Colony, named after, I think, one of the ship's captains. The Popham Colony lasted exactly 1 year one person died, everyone else lost interest in the whole thing, and they thumbed a ride with somebody that happened to be sailing by and got back to England. The Jamestown colony is a horse of a different color. It more or less thrived. It didn't thrive a whole lot in the first, say, 10 years, but eventually it caught on and started growing. Let's look at that. I'm not going to go into all the little stories and all that about Pocahontas saving John Smith and all of that, but let's talk about some important names. John Smith is an important name. You see, the people in this first group were all kind of adventurers or second sons, guys that were, what do we say, on the make. They were out looking for money. They didn't have any. Maybe they had enough money to, maybe their father or their older brother gave them some money so they could at least buy passage on one of the ships. They didn't have the skill. Most of them probably didn't know how to do a normal job at all. So they were not suited to set up a colony. There were 100 men altogether in the first group, no women. That's always on the exam, so be ready for it. There was one man sent along that had at least claimed to have experience in stuff like this. He was a little bit more worldly than most of these people. His name was John Smith. And I'm not sure exactly why they do this, but I know Navy still do this, and this is kind of a naval sort of thing. They'll put sealed orders about what you're going to do when you get there, but you're not allowed to open the orders until you get there. And in those sealed orders, they make John Smith responsible for the security of the colony. But he's a little bit older. It's kind of like the story of my life. And these young people really, he spoke a different language than young people did. And eventually they got angry enough at him for asserting himself that they kind of locked him up in one of the ships. And then when they opened the orders, when they got to Chesapeake Bay, lo and behold, he's supposed to be in charge of their security, so they had to let him go. 100 men went there. By the end of the first winter, there's only 35 or so left. They all died. They weren't prepared to do what they had to do. John Smith's going around having, like herding cats, having to force them to work, to build shelter and things like that. They're all wanting to look around for gold on the ground and stuff like that. They didn't like him because he made them do things they didn't want to do. The few that survived can thank John Smith. And one of the things he did, he went and made contact with indigenous people. And knew there had to be somebody living out there. He bumps into a confederation of Indians. It's a bunch of tribes. They're really small tribes that we'll call the Powhatan Confederation. Haha, thank you, Walt Disney. The most important leader of the Powhatan Confederation was not named Powhatan. He was named Wahum Seneca. His name's on that slide. Try saying that 3 times without spitting on your friends. That's why we all call him Powhatan, probably, because nobody can spell it or say it. Here's the deal. These people, strange people, arrived in his territory. The question is, now what? We can do one of 3 things. We can just kill them all and not have to put up with them. We can help them, or we can kind of just back away into the woodwork and watch them starve to death. And he decided to help them. And he developed a relationship with John Smith. Where Pocahontas, and her name wasn't Pocahontas, where she fit into that, it's not really clear. But what we do know is when John Smith arrived there, Pocahontas had not reached puberty yet, and children that didn't reach puberty never wore clothes or anything like that. So she was a brave little girl, I guess, and she wasn't afraid to, kind of like kids do on a dare, running in the middle of the English settlement and then run out again, that sort of thing. But no, John Smith and Pocahontas never had anything going. But they knew each other. And from time to time in the early years, even though Wahum Seneca decided, let's help him out a little bit, and he did. He helped them with food and things like that. He had his own relatives, like it may have been his much younger brother or a cousin or something named Opakano, who told him over and over again, you need to kill them all because they're going to multiply, and then they're going to be big trouble. And boy, was he right. But they didn't kill them all, at least not at first. The girl we call Pocahontas was Mataoka, was her name. At one point, when there was some fighting between some of the colonists and some of the Indians, one of the colonists saw her. She was out playing somewhere. Probably by that time she'd reached puberty, and they kidnapped her to hold her as a hostage to protect them against the Indians. And those strange things always happen. I mean, she was kidnapped, and she decided she liked her kidnappers, and eventually there's a minister in the group, and he's going to convince her to become a Christian, and he's going to baptize her. By that time, the fighting with the Indians has kind of died down, and they actually go as far as, she says, if Wahum Sonokal says it's okay, I'd like to be baptized. And he gave permission. So they baptized her. We'll talk about her a little bit more in a minute. The years 1608 to 1610 are called the starving time, and they were still kind of iffy whether they would survive or not. There were more people coming in, but the numbers don't add up. What I'm saying is, if you added up all the people that you have in the books saying they came into the colony, they don't equal the number of people in the colony. They're much, much, much more than the number of people that were actually in the colony. And who knows what happened to the rest of the people? A lot of people were dying. They had a really high mortality rate, but I don't think that totally answers the question. I think some of them probably just got independent and moved somewhere else and set up housekeeping. Because by the early 1620s, there wasn't much more than 1,500 people in that colony. And a lot more than that had already come over. At any rate, another important name is a young man named John Rolfe. He came in maybe the second stage. Pretty early, but not in the first group. On the way over, John Rolfe had seen some of the tobacco that people had brought back from Roanoke and other places. It was pretty acrid. They knew people smoked it after a fashion. They weren't sure exactly how, but it was very acrid. And he stopped on his way over for some reason in the Canary Islands, which was actually a Spanish possession, and they had some really, really mild tobacco that the Spaniards had brought maybe from South America. So he got some of those seedlings and put them on the ship with him. And when he showed up in Jamestown, is what they call that first thing, named after King James. By the way, they moved Jamestown up onto higher ground because it was almost a swamp, which probably explains why a lot of them died early on. But when he showed up with this mild kind of tobacco, and he started playing around with the local tobacco, and ends up with a mild version. Still had some kick to it, but it was milder than the Indian tobacco that was going in North America. And pretty quickly, he realized that it was of value to him because people were buying it from him. And within just a few years, he's rolling in money, and everybody else in the colony wants to grow tobacco. And they're actually going to start doing that. And the economy of the colony was purely tobacco. What do I mean? They didn't have coins, they didn't have money, they didn't have gold. So everything was expressed in terms of value of tobacco. So like if you, I don't know, got caught speeding on your, well, they didn't even have horses then. If you got caught running too fast or something and you were fined by the local JP, you paid your fine in bales of tobacco. If you saw a cutie that you wanted to hook up with, you paid her daddy X number of bales of tobacco. Girls that, had dowries, as some girls did back then, the dowries were all bales of tobacco. It's still not a going concern though, and it's still like a herd of cats. pulling in all different directions. They put a man in charge of it named Thomas West. His family had explorers in it. He was the 3rd Baron de la Warr. You may recognize the sound of that name, and yes, something was named after him later on. He's going to try and instill order so they can get this colony really organized. John Smith is gone. He's gone back to England. He got hurt in an explosion of some freak explosion of gunpowder. Not really badly hurt, but his face was scarred. And he had also been busy. He didn't really like the people in the colony. He'd been sailing up and down the coast, kind of charting it. Got all the way maybe as far up as where New York is. Then he went home, and this fellow Thomas West takes over in about 1609. In theory, he's in charge. He doesn't really live in the colony. He visits it quite often. And he's going to find a hard-nosed guy by the name of Thomas Gates, and he's going to set up some real draconian laws, or extremely harsh laws, to keep this colony in order. They hated him. They hated his laws. He made a lot of tobacco on it with fines. You can't get people to go to the colonies. It's got a bum rap. It's not a bum rap, it's the truth. It's not a nice place to live. And the Virginia company's going, well, we're losing money. It's not making any profit for us. So they hire a guy named Sir Edwin Sandys. Remember his name, because he comes up with a bunch of good ideas. He'd done things kind of like this before. First thing he does is he starts using publicity. He gets really colorful posters and things talking about wonderful Virginia. You know, just like nowadays, you know, don't believe it just because it's printed. Gets some reaction, but not much. He comes up with an idea. Remember England, remember enclosure, those of you who struggled through that test? Land was at a premium in England. But people that came over to the Americas would come over with the hope of having land. Of course, their idea of how much is a lot is a lot different from you and me in West Texas, because, you know, 50 acres is like your backyard for a lot of people in West Texas. But what they did was they promised if you would pay the expense of getting your family and maybe some of your friends on a ship and go over to that colony, you would be awarded 50 acres of land. That got some people's attention, and you started getting some people nibbling at that and going over. But some people are just either too smart or too timid to get on a ship and go across the North Atlantic then. And so they also, he came up with them, that was called head right, okay? Where you paid your own way and then they'd give you land. He comes up with another notion and he says, okay, you don't want to go. If you can hire a proxy and a bunch of his friends to go in your place, you don't even have to go and we'll still give you 50 acres of the land over there. That's called a share right. And once again, it built up the number of people. But now, in the Virginia colony, aside from fighting Indians, they're having another problem. And the problem is, pardon me, I'm going to sit down. Tobacco eats up land. And if you want to grow enough to make money on it, you got to have more land. And if you have more land, then your family doesn't have enough hands to grow the tobacco anymore. So Sir Edwin Sandys comes up with another idea. He starts telling people, you know, putting up posters everywhere saying, free passage to America, just sign this contract. And what people were doing is they were indenturing themselves. They were promising to work for somebody for somewhere in the vicinity of 7 years in order to get free passage. Almost, not quite, but almost slaves. I mean, they couldn't cut out on their contract. They couldn't break their contract. Judge would get them and send them right back. And if they misbehaved, and who's going to interpret that? If they misbehaved, you could go to court and extend their contracts. So that wasn't very nice either. But initially, their labor force is going to be indentured servants. Technically not slaves, but very close to being that. Now, if they served out their 7 years, they're free. And then they could go get land of their own. That was the promise. You'll see in the next few days as we talk that that promise was a little bit difficult to realize, but anyway, that got them to labor and more people into the colony. So Sandys was pretty effective. Another thing he did was, he told the people that lived there, you can have your own government. Now, they already knew they could select their own governor. I mean, there was an overall guy that the company put in charge, but the local guy, you know, Sandy said, okay, you can pick your own governor, and you can have your own little legislature. And they called it the House of Burgesses. Burgesses, that was an old English word for people that are in business and have land or have property, who pay tax. Burgesses were the only people who could vote in England for many, many years. The English suffrage, about, at this time, I don't know what it was, but say 60 years later than this, only about 1% of the males in England could vote. And of course, women, you know, not for a long time. So now they've got a governor and a House of Burgesses to run things. But it's still like herding cats. It's still kind of a mess. In the meantime, Opequon was trying to kill them off. In about 1820, I can't remember, 22, in between 22 and 24 anyway, he killed 300 colonists. And when you only have 1,500 to start with, that's a major portion of the population. The following year, the colonists killed off about 200 Indians. That was pretty bad. They had a party when they made peace, right? They had a big party and they fed them wine and they spiked it with poison. Good old civilized English friends. Chemical and biological warfare in America. So the Crown finally got set up, and the Crown said, we're revoking your charter. That was in 1624. They revoked their charter, and they sent over a royal governor who had real legal power and some people to help him enforce the law, and the colony kind of got back on the right track. The thing was that early people that showed up, or people that showed up later but had money to buy those share rights and already owned land over there, number in a very small number. And so you're going to have 4 or 5 families that owned most of everything. But the indentured servants are hoping, you know, just wait for a few more years and I'll own something too. Didn't work out too well that way. The Birds, I can't remember all the families, but they're names that, for heaven's sakes, you still hear from Virginia and Congress and things like that. So let's leave that colony. By about 1650, they have somewhere in the vicinity of 15,000 people. That's not very big if you compare it to the next group I'm going to talk about. I'll show you this. I'm showing you the slides out of order. There was an act passed in 1559. This is long before these colonies in England. Before Queen Elizabeth died, making it a requirement to attend the Church of England, attend services. And for every church service you missed, it cost you something in the vicinity of $25. Can you imagine that? Okay, everybody fess up. How much money would you have lost? And if you actually tried to conduct a service that was an official Church of England, you could be imprisoned, you could be actually executed. While James was king, a number of people would be executed for that. So if you have these people who tend to be followers of John Calvin, they don't like the fancy Church of England because it looks just like the Catholic Church, and they're Protestants. They think that, you know, the ministers in the Church of England, they look just like Catholic priests. They walk around with expensive clothes and do all these things that the regular Catholic priest did, and they don't like it. So they try and worship alone, privately, but if they get caught, they're in deep kimchi. So one group who said there's no way we can change the Church of England, so let's just get away from it. We'll call them pilgrims. Pilgrims are just wandering people. That's what pilgrim actually is. They're Puritans, but we'll call them the pilgrims. And they look around in Europe and over in Holland, the country that's still fighting the Spanish for its independence. Those people in the part that's trying to fight for independence are Calvinists, so they're kind of kindred spirits. So this group of people that we'll call the pilgrims goes over to Holland. They went to several different places, but they ended up in a city called Leiden, L-E-Y-D-E-N or L-E-I-D-E-N. Depends on, what side of the bed you got up in the morning. They were treated all right, but the Dutch wouldn't give them citizenship. So they couldn't really participate in profitable trade or anything like that. They could only do little odds and ends kind of work. And they weren't real happy about that. Then their children were starting to look like little Dutch kids, speaking more Hollandish or Netherlandish than they were speaking English. They were getting homesick, but they certainly didn't want to go around where Bishop Laud was there and, doing bad things to people that didn't go to the Church of England. So they sent an emissary out, and they got in touch with the London Company, and they found some sponsors and said to the London Company, we want you to arrange a charter for us. May have been the Plymouth Company, don't worry about it, it's not in my exam. If you're curious, you can look it up, but at any rate, contact is made. These people get some sponsorship. Why would anyone sponsor these people? It has to do with what people knew about the Americas. It's hard to understand because we talk about all these first people as being the explorers and all of that. But people in Europe knew that off the north coast of North America, there were abundant fisheries and places like that, and they were very valuable. You could if you load one shipload of cured fish, of good cured fish, could set you up for life. And what they did was they go over there and they had no refrigeration or ice or anything. You go over there, you fish, you catch the fish, you put all your catch on the shore, you clean it, and then you drop it in barrels filled with brine and salt. And you more or less cured it in that, and you could take it home, it wouldn't spoil. And the people in England, some of that had money, I think one group called the Merchant Adventurers and some other groups like that, they wanted cod. Cod's a very valuable fish because it's an oily fish, and not only is the flesh of the fish nourishing, but cod liver oil is very valuable. And even back then, it was recognized as a medicine. You ever seen cod liver oil? You ever heard of it? Boy, are you lucky. In my generation, people got the wild idea that it's kind of like this animal medicine that people are taking to keep from getting COVID. People got the idea that if you took cod liver oil, you wouldn't get TB, which is a big problem back then. So every day in school, first class, when I was in the first grade in our little wooden floored schoolhouse, the school nurse would show up with a big ugly spoon and a bottle of cod liver oil, and every student got a mouthful of it. Same spoon too, boy, they were really worried about sanitation, right? Anyway, cod liver oil was very valuable, so these fish were valuable. That's where they got the money to buy the ships and all that. They didn't get the money from the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company were the facilitators. They took money. They didn't give money. But anyway, here's the plan. They got enough money to get 2 ships. They're going to load it up with people. Now, they got smart. They realized that amongst their believers, their co-believers, their people that had the same religious beliefs, they didn't have enough people who could do some of the things they needed done if they were going to build a colony. Blacksmith, maybe. Or hunters, maybe. Or people that took care of security. So what they did was they recruited people who could do those things. So now you got kind of two groups. You got the believers, and you've got the people that are coming along because they've got skills. And actually there were more of those than there were believers. And the Pilgrims called themselves the saints, and they called the other people the strangers. And later on, the Puritans that go to Massachusetts are going to be the same way. They have a lot of similarities. They have one major difference, but a lot of similarities. Anyway, so they're all loaded on these ships, and they tried to kind of soup up one of the ships because it really didn't look like it would move fast enough across the ocean. So they put larger masts in it and bigger sails. And it's just like with an automobile or an airplane. If it's engineered for a certain size engine, you don't go messing around because you end up, with a bucket of bolts. In this case, with the big mast and sails and all that, the ship practically pulled itself apart, started leaking. They landed, I think, at one British port, tried to repair the ship, tried to sail again, and it really started leaking. And so they said, we're not trying to cross the Atlantic in this. So they tried to sell that ship to raise money, and they decided on one ship. So they're going to have to cull the crowd. Not so many people can go on the first trip. It'll be a little bit over 100, but a major portion of them, maybe as much as 55% of them, are the strangers, not the saints. Maybe 40-60 is a good proportion. You all know the name of the ship because you studied it in your little golden book of history. Anybody? I mean, there's even like a group who claims they're descendants of the people on that ship. You can get a little plaque and put it on your wall. You have to prove it. What's the name of the ship? Nobody knows? The Mayflower. The Mayflower. And to make the long story short, they make a long and very, very punishing trip across the Atlantic, and they're all sick and all that. Here's the big problem. When they had the trouble with the other ship, they were planning to be over there in the early summer so they could plant crops. They didn't get there until December. Anybody been up in Boston in December? You probably wouldn't want to walk around in your bare feet or anything. So they get over to North America and they bump shore on this little thing of rock. Let me see if I can find it. There it is. It's called Cape Cod. Remember those fish that everyone thought they could catch? They get off the ship. They bury one of the members that died on the ship. A lady, can't remember her name, don't care. They're a little short on food now. They've eaten most of their food, and the rest of it's pretty much spoiled. They send out a scouting party with Miles Standish. He's one of the strangers. He's their security chief. He's going to find some food. And then he's going to wonder why the Indians are chasing him when he starts back to his ship. Because it was on burial platforms. It was offerings for the dead, And these weirdo looking white people would come and steal it off the platform. They have some run-ins with Indians all along, continually. But not as bad as they could have been. So the people had to make up their minds. We landed in the wrong place. We're way north of where we're supposed to be. We don't have a charter for this place. So we got two options. We can either land here without a charter and then apply for one later, or we can get back on the ship, sail back out in that lovely ocean, and go down to where we're supposed to be. And nobody wanted back on that ship. I mean, there were people that lived on it, more or less, but nobody wanted to go back in the ocean. So they voted, they sat down, and everybody signed on. It's kind of like a round robin. So everybody took responsibility for their decision, and they call that the Mayflower Compact. It was not a constitution or anything like that. All it was their general agreement how they were going to run this. Then they decided, well, we can't park on this rocky, sandy piece of land out here, and they found a better place. on the mainland, and went across Cape Cod Bay, and set foot on land near a place called Plymouth. They were really, really, really lucky. When they set foot on land, they're going to run into a tribe of mild-mannered, friendly Indians called the Wampanoags. Where are they? Now that arrow points at the Wampanoags, stomping grounds. You notice if you go out further on where that Cape Cod is, there's another tribe listed called the Nausets. They were extinct by the time the settlers got there. They died off from, we think, maybe a soil-borne disease. Some others had died off on further ashore. In fact, one of their first things of good luck was they found a place with cleared fields and everything. It was just perfect for building a village on. And what we figured out later on was that there was a tribe of Indians that lived there. They cleared the fields so they could plant, and then they died off, or disappeared, or whatever. But they meet the Wampanoags, and of course they can't speak their language, and the Wampanoags can't speak English, until this kind of squirrely looking guy comes walking out. He's not really a Wampanoag, but he lives with them because his whole tribe is extinct. He's a Nauset Indian, and his name was Tisquantum. And he says, "Hello, how are you? Nice to see you." And they freak out because he's speaking English. And he's going to serve as their guide and their translator. They're going to meet one of the most important leaders of the Wampanoag people, a fellow by the name of Massasoit. And between Squanto and Massasoit, they're going to agree to help the colonists out. They're going to teach the colonists how to grow food in that particular climate, in that area, in that kind of soil. Part of it, you know, they use fish for fertilizer, but it wasn't like fish fertilizer you see now. It was, they just stick a dead fish in a hole next to the plant, and it seemed to work. They're going to feed them some until they're self-sufficient. Initially, they all live in this little compound, which is probably as small as this room, the whole colony of people. You know, inside kind of, they put up like tree trunks for barrier. They put a cannon up on a high place not too far away. That's going to be to protect them from ocean-going people and what have you. I'm sure they got sick and tired of each other's faces, having been confined on that little ship. So pretty quickly they start testing the water. I'm going to go a little bit out this way. I'm going to go a little bit that way. And they started kind of little villages that were basically, you know, one family. And all along they're going to have help from reasonably friendly Indians until they misbehave. But this colony is going to grow much, much faster than Jamestown. And in following years, more and more ships are going to show up with more and more people. One of the problems the Indians have with them, they quickly discover that there's fur available. They buy it from the Indians. They start hunting their own fur. As soon as the livestock start showing up like pigs and goats, they're smaller than cows, so they're easier to bring across. They start destroying the Indians' crops, so the Indians are ever so slightly resentful of that. Up until this time, they've lived in an environment where they just put the seeds in the ground and walk away and go hunting somewhere else, and a few months later there's food there. And that's not going to happen anymore. So there's pushing and shoving, but basically Massasoit got along with their second governor. He's a guy named William Bradford. You might want to write his name down. The first governor was out of office within a year, less than a year. The guy that was initially running it was one of the Weston family, but he wasn't even in the colony, I don't think, or maybe he was. Didn't want to be governor. William Bradford will become really close friends with Massasoit. And so every time there's a little tiff somewhere, together they're able to settle it. When they die, and they died within 2 years of each other, when they die, that safety net's going to be gone. And the more secure the colonists become, the pushier they get. Now they don't need the Indians to grow food for them or anything like that anymore. They're not going to aggressively try and make the Indians work for them. They're going to try and convert some of them to Christian, or give them Christian names. They're going to try and use the European concepts of government to talk to Indians who have a totally different concept of government. That doesn't work really well. They're going to give all the Indians English names, and they don't have a chief. They start calling them kings. You're king of this tribe, you're king of that tribe. Sometimes it goes over all right, and sometimes not. Massasoit's son is going to die. His younger brother is going to take over, a guy named Metacomet. Eventually, they're going to have strife. Some of the colonists claim that an Indian did damage, and the colonists. And this happens. The Americans have done this more than you'd believe, and especially in regards to American Indians. Some Indians shoot you, right? So what do? You go find a village of Indians. They may not even know about the story at all, and you just wipe out their village. We'll show you, right? And so that kind of unreasonable reaction, and they didn't have the wisdom of William Bradford or the wisdom of Massasoit to smooth things over, start getting worse and worse conflicts in between them. We'll talk about those conflicts after we talk about Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, there's another group of Puritans that are also unhappy with the church. But these are people who think, if we just set a good example, we can change the church. So they want to separate from the Church of England. They want to change the Church of England. The most famous of the colonists is a fellow, he's a lawyer and a preacher. Watch out. I mean, the only thing more dangerous than lawyers, somebody that's both a lawyer and a preacher at the same time, maybe a preacher's daughter. My daddy warned me when I was just hitting puberty, stay away from preachers' daughters. Apparently he'd had some bad experience. Anyway, and I'm sorry if any of you are preachers' daughters. I'll give you an example of Massachusetts Bay in that. But anyhow, these guys, they buy a charter way back in 1629 and kind of diddle around and don't get organized and all that, and you get up to almost 1630 and they're going to have to renew permissions and all of a sudden all sorts of problems. But they want to go over there too. And they're going to get a charter. I'm looking really madly through my notes because I can never remember this. They're going to get a charter through another joint stock company. I can't remember if the merchant adventurers were involved in backing this colony. Let me look. They get it from, there's a new council. One of the things that's confusing, and because we're studying American history and we're not studying English history, this was new to England too, right? So initially, the Privy Council, that's the King's Executive Council that makes all the decisions in the country, they're going to run it. But then, that's too much work for us. They're going to hand it off and they'll have the Lords of Trade or something like that. And they will run colonization and trade and all of that. And as years go by, it keeps morphing, it keeps changing. Eventually, many years later, around the time of the American Revolution, they'll have a secretary for the colonies. But they're going to get their charter. They're going to get it from the Council for New England. They started calling this northern part of North America New England. They're going to call themselves the Massachusetts Bay Company. Charles I is still alive. He'll sign off on it. They're going to have saints and strangers just like the Pilgrims did. They're going to load up on several ships. On one of them is this lawyer preacher by the name of John Winthrop. You might want to write his name down. I think I may have it in here somewhere. Maybe not. No, I don't. It's spelled W-I-N-T-H-R-O-P. says in this set of notes that the merchant adventurers were involved in that. What you call these, like the Pilgrims and these Puritans, you call them Congregationalists. Does anybody know what that means? It's not a, I know we have churches called Congregational Church, but it's not about a religion exactly. Congregationalist churches are autocephalous. At that, it's not a disease. It means they're in charge of their church and there's not a higher church over them. These guys are Congregationalists. The Pilgrims were Congregationalists. These guys think we're going to go kind of build a utopia that the whole world will see, and then they'll follow our example. Winthrop gets into gear. They're still on the ship coming over, and he's preaching about, we shall be as a city on a hill, you know, shining example. Takes that straight out of the Bible, by the way. And a whole bunch of American politicians since him have borrowed that. I'm trying to think of some in recent years. I don't want to say because I might be wrong, but anyway, you hear that over and over again. He's talking about something that sounds almost like going to the Holy Land. They'll call this the wilderness of Zion, etc., etc. But what he's really telling the people is, the world's watching us, so if we fail, we're going to look really bad. And he's on and off going to be the governor. And as soon as those ships hit land, they're going to organize the same way, pretty much the same way that Pilgrims organized. They're going to profit from the example set by the Pilgrims. And ships are going to start arriving in large numbers eventually. Within the next, say, 10 or 20 years, there'll be 80,000 people there. And eventually they're going to grow so big that they absorb Plymouth, and it all becomes one big colony. They have what they call a general court, which is kind of what the Pilgrims had. That was their government. You could only vote there if you were a saint. Strangers couldn't vote there. They had kind of indirect elections. They could choose their governor. This is a larger group, and it's a little bit less homogeneous. They're not people that have been through all the same travails with each other. And so you're going to start seeing some discord in these colonies. One is a tax protest that happens just 2 years after they get there, because the general court's levying taxes on people that they don't like. Then you have people arguing, hey, we believe in the purity of the church and all that, and you guys are drifting away from it. You're starting to make up new rules or whatever. There's people protesting that. Other people are feeling bad because they're grabbing Indian land without saying even thank you. They're pushing the Indians around. Some people think they're going to have trouble. One of the protesters, and I know we've got 60 seconds to go, one of the protesters was a fellow named Roger Williams. And he caused so much trouble. He was a preacher too, but he caused so much trouble to the leadership that they banished him from the colony, which is virtually a death sentence. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to get food? But he was arguing, among other things, that about the bad treatment of the Indians, and the Indians really liked him, and some Narragansett Indians latched onto him and said, never fear, don't worry, we know a place that's a lot nicer to live in than this. And that's going to result in the founding of Rhode Island eventually. And then there's a woman, and we'll talk about her next time, I'll start with that, named Anne Hutchinson, and she's a preacher's daughter. So, get ready. Okay, folks, anybody got any questions or whatever about assignments, tests, or anything like that? Technical problems, let me know. I think I've answered all the emails I've got. Except one or two people keep insisting on sending them through the email channel instead of in the messenger channel. And it's easier for me to keep track of them if they're in the messenger channel, so sometimes I miss the emails and don't answer them really quickly. Take a look at all the new notes, and I'll put the new notes up as soon as I get back to my office.
But I mean, my mind's been kind of like rushing
Yeah.
with it and trying to email you about my book.
Okay.
Did I just tell you? Did I just email you about it?
No, you need to email me because I have to look at the list and see if anyone else is
Okay,
using
alright,
it.
I just had to
Okay?
make it.
In fact, look at that check-in sheet. Does it have book titles next to it?
No.
Okay, I should have put the book title so you could see the book that we're taking.
Yeah, 'cause I already picked